Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you may be today. We're bringing this webinar to you live from the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And again, just thank you so much to our guests joining us from abroad. We've got people joining us from Europe, New Zealand, Australia, and we're all in different time zones today. My name is Swayam Chandra. I will be your co-moderator for this afternoon, along with my colleague Eddy. And just a little bit of background, I've been working or involved in the community corrections field for about 6 years now, and I've been a member of the Citizens Advisory Committee for about 3 years. I'll hand it over to Dennis Herfst, who is the Area Director for Metro Vancouver West Community Corrections, for a bit of background on Correctional Service of Canada, as well as the role of the Citizens Advisory Committee.
Thank you, Swayam, and good afternoon. As Swayam said, I guess I should also say good morning and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. I won't say good night, because then you might all leave. So, but thank you. It's my privilege to be able to offer a warm welcome to all our participants from wherever you're joining us today. For those that don't know me, my name is Dennis Herfst. I'm the Area Director overseeing the Vancouver Parole District for the Correctional Service of Canada. And our local office is based in downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. So as Swayam said, I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories from where we're coming to you today from, of the Coast Salish people, and specifically the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It's an honor to be here again this year. This is our third annual event. And I'll maybe just start by giving a very brief background of who we are in CSC and what the CAC is all about. And then I'll turn it over to Eddy for some more introductions following that. But basically, we're part of the Federal Correctional Service of Canada. It's a federal correctional system that is responsible for the care and custody of offenders serving sentences of 2 years or more. So that involves both the penitentiary portion of their sentence, as well as when they come out to the community on conditional release or parole. In Vancouver, where we're based, we supervise approximately 275 offenders on release. And it's a real team approach to what we do there. We have parole officers that work closely with program staff who deliver programs. We have mental health teams. We have Indigenous staff, our Indigenous Community Liaison Advisors and Indigenous Community Development Officers. We have Security Intelligence Officers. We work closely with our halfway house partners, where many of our offenders reside when they're on release in the community. We work closely with police, the parole board, and it's very much a team approach to supervision. And it's kind of a dual mandate that we're responsible for, both the care and custody of these offenders and assisting in their reintegration, but also ultimately the protection of the public, which is our paramount consideration within the correctional service. The role of our CACs, our citizen advisory committees, these are groups of volunteers, and they are attached. There's a local committee attached to almost every penitentiary and parole office in the country. And so today's event is sponsored by our local one here in Vancouver, our local citizen advisory committee, of which Eddy Elmer is our vice chair, and you'll be hearing from him in just a moment. And so their role on the CAC is to observe, liaise, and advise with respect to correctional operations, policies, and procedures. So they are, again, community volunteers, and their goal is to provide impartial advice and feedback to us within the correctional service on our operations and our procedures and policy. So they might join us visiting the institutions. They can tour our halfway houses and parole offices. They can sit in on our program boards. They can meet with offenders to check in with them and see how they're doing and hear their feedback. And locally, we meet once a month. And we will discuss any pressing events or issues within our area, as well as the broader correctional service from across the country. So it's wonderful to have this group of volunteers. I'm very fortunate and privileged to be associated with a very vibrant group here in Vancouver. And that's part of the background to these webinars. This is now our third annual event, as I mentioned earlier. The first 2 years we spoke on topics of aging offenders, and then last year was on the topic of victims. And so this year we're, as I think most of you know, looking at public safety through support and accountability, and specifically looking at a couple different cohorts of offenders, specifically lifers and sex offenders, and some of the supports and accountability measures that are in place to work with these individuals. Just looking at my notes here, in terms of participants, we have upwards of 375 people registered. And I know not all of them are able to join us live for the webinar right now, and that's fine. Many people have registered and will be able to watch the recording later, but that's a wonderful amount. We're thrilled to have that kind of cross-section of people. We have people from all across the country here in Canada, as well as the United States, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, Estonia, Italy, South Africa, Nigeria, and Pakistan. And there may be others. I'm sorry if I've missed you, but those are the ones we've kind of noted with the pre-registrations. And if anybody is from anywhere else, feel free to give a shout out in the chat. But again, I want to give a very, very warm welcome to all our participants, wherever you may be joining us from. Thank you for taking time out of your day. Again, I know it's a bit of a challenge when we have some international speakers and people from different parts of the world to try and find a time that works for everybody. So I know people are really making a commitment to attend today. So thank you to all our participants. And that said, I also want to thank our panelists for being willing to share your expertise and knowledge and perspectives as well. I'm very excited to hear from all of you. This is the first time we've had international panelists and speakers, and so it's a great opportunity for us as well here in Canada and within the correctional service here to hear about some best practices from around the world in relation to these topics. So thank you in advance to each of our panelists for making the time to attend as well and share your expertise. And last but not least, I also want to thank Eddy and Swayam, our co-moderators who are part of our local citizen advisory committee, for really taking the lead with helping put this together. I know Eddy was a real instrumental in that, and thank you, Swayam, as well, for helping moderate today. And again, I apologize for competing with the World Cup for those of you that are trying to watch the soccer game in the background. So I gave up after Canada lost, so our hopes have already been dashed after 2 games. So next time. But with that, again, welcome to everybody. Enjoy. I hope you'll find this engaging, and I'll turn it over to Eddy.
Sure. Thank you, Dennis. I should note, I think we had somebody log in a little while ago from Fiji, so I think we're truly global today. So that's quite exciting. As Dennis said, my name is Eddy. I'm the Vice Chair of the Citizen Advisory Committee here for Metro Vancouver West Community Corrections. I'm also a perpetual PhD student in gerontology. I study aging, particularly in marginalized groups, including 2S LGBTQ adults and aging offenders. I will be co-hosting and moderating today's webinar with Swayam. As Dennis said, for this 3rd annual webinar, we're focusing on the theme of public safety through support and accountability, with a focus on offenders in the community who are serving a life sentence, colloquially known as lifers, and also those who've been convicted of a sexual offense. In many countries, including here in Canada, most offenders will eventually be released into the community. In order to successfully reintegrate, they require as much support as possible to reconnect with their communities and to reduce the risk of reoffending. Lifers and those convicted of a sexual offense require specific supports. After many years in prison, lifers on parole must adapt to a world that can feel overwhelming, unpredictable, and foreign. And those who've been convicted of a sexual offense must learn to change the specific attitudes, thoughts, and behaviors associated with their offending. And both groups must also acknowledge and understand the impact of their crime on victims, the victims' families, their own families, and of the broader community. These are key elements of restorative justice and for successful reintegration into our communities. So today we're going to be hearing from 5 speakers who will address community-based supports for these 2 groups of offenders and their families. And just by way of a brief introduction, we have Edmunds-Flett, Executive Director of Long-Term Inmates Now in the Community, an organization here in British Columbia. We have Dr. Wendy VanderWal Martin, who's the Associate Director of Circles of Support and Accountability Canada. She's joining us from Ontario. And with her is Cristina Abasolo of CoSA Vancouver Fraser Valley, where she is a volunteer and also the communications lead. We have Dr. Belinda, a professor of forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University in the UK, and Corrina Thompson, who is the senior mentoring coordinator at Pillars New Zealand, which is an organization supporting children with a parent or family member serving a sentence in prison or in the community. So I'm going to turn it over to Swayam with a few housekeeping things, and then we will start with our speakers.
Great, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Eddy. So just a few housekeeping items before we get started today. Just to let everyone know, the webinar will be recorded, and within a week or so, we'll be sending out a link to the recording as well as posting the recording on YouTube. In the event that the webinar is accidentally cut off, give us about a few minutes to get ourselves together, and we'll restart the webinar and allow everyone to rejoin as well. If you're having any audio or video problems, a solution might be to try using a personal device rather than your work device. This might help with any technical issues you might be experiencing. And most importantly, due to the sensitivity of what might be discussed today, we ask that everyone maintain this space and be as respectful as possible. And just to make sure we all have a role to play in making sure that this is a safe space where we're all learning from one another as well. As Eddy mentioned earlier, we do have the auto-generated closed captioning feature enabled on Zoom. I think everyone should have their own ability to turn it off. So if you are finding it a bit distracting, you should be able to turn it off. I think there's a symbol CC that you can simply click. It may take a few minutes to start working if you do decide to enable it. And again, just a gentle reminder to our speakers to please speak clearly so that the closed captioning can pick up on your words. And just a general reminder, each speaker will have about 20 minutes to go over their topic, and then followed by a 30-minute Q&A at the end of each presentation. Our guests are welcome to type questions in the chat and Q&A. Myself and Eddy will put those questions together, and we'll do our best to pose the questions to our guest speakers at the end of their presentations. So without further ado, I'll hand the mic back to Eddy, and I'll allow him to give a bit of a bigger introduction to Sherry Edmunds-Flett.
Thank you, Swayam. So our first speaker is Sherry Edmunds-Flett. Is my video showing all right?
Yep, your video set looks good.
Thank you. So Sherry is the Executive Director of Long-Term Inmates Now in the Community, also known as LINC, which is in Abbotsford, British Columbia. She founded LINC with her late husband, Glenn Flett, who served 23 years for the shooting death of a Hudson's Bay store manager during a holdup in Toronto. After being paroled, Glenn devoted his life to restorative justice, not only supporting offenders to live pro-social lives, but also empowering victims. In addition to support groups, LINC operates Emma's Acres, which is a 3.2-hectare farm that employs survivors and victims, as well as current and former offenders, and food from the farm is donated to the community. LINC has been featured in the national and international press and has won numerous awards for diversity, inclusion, and community development, as have Sherry and her husband personally. Most notably, Sherry won the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for her work in the community. She's currently working on her PhD in African Canadian history at SFU. She will give a little bit of a history of how LINC was founded and then give us some details about the services that LINC provides. So Sherry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you everybody for being here today. I'm sorry if I look sort of off. I'm bedridden. I had COVID and I haven't been able to walk since. But I would first like to acknowledge that I'm on the unceded, ancestral, and shared lands for the Stolo people, and my municipality is on the Kwantlen, Lakamal, Matsqui, and Scowitz territories. It was 50 years ago, on July the 11th, 1972, that I woke up to my parents crouched in the dark, looking out the front window of my bedroom. They were listening to the faint voices of soldiers across the road, searching the swamp for 14 prisoners who escaped from Millhaven Institution several miles away the day before. Growing up outside of Kingston, Ontario, which was known as the prison capital of Canada, I was used to reading in our newspaper, the Whig Standard, about disturbances and murders inside the nearby prisons. My dad was a plumbing contractor who often was called into institutions after riots to fix smashed toilets and sinks. I didn't think about the people who were behind the prison walls we drove past daily on the way into town, to the shopping center, to the library, or to school. It was not until 5 years after the escape from Millhaven, when I was 19 years old, that I first went into a penitentiary and my life changed forever. Ever since I was asked to participate in this webinar, I've been thinking about what I want to say about reintegration and what it means to re-enter society after spending extended periods in time behind walls. My perspective as an ally has been shaped by my experiences over the past 4 decades in a number of different roles: as a volunteer, as the wife of a lifer, a contractor with the Correctional Service of Canada, and as the executive director of LINC, Long-Term Inmates Now in the Community, which is a registered nonprofit charity. People in Canada know about LINC, but I haven't ever really explained about how LINC started, so I wanted to do that for a bit today. So, during my second year of university, I joined the Queen's University West Indian Club and was elected to the executive as a social convener. A Lutheran minister who worked at Millhaven Institution, which is an institution in the Ontario region that is a maximum security male institution. He had asked us to come to the prison to attend a Black Inmates and Friends Association or BIFA meeting. We did that, and it was there that I met Ronnie Grant, the president, and Glenn Flett, the social convener. We began attending the meetings inside Millhaven every 2 weeks for the next 2 years, until I went to the University of California, Los Angeles for my master's degree. Ronnie, Glenn, and most of the men in the group were at the beginning of a life sentence. So they were not thinking about how they were going to get out to the wider world, but how they were going to live in the one that they were now in. While away at school in the United States, I kept in touch with Ronnie, who got married to an older woman while he was in the Bay, which is Collins Bay Institution, which is a medium men's institution back in Ontario. He transferred to another institution and made day parole to a halfway house that she and his wife had designed. Glenn, meanwhile, had transferred out here to what's known as the Pacific region, to Kent Institution, which is a maximum security male institution in Agassiz, BC, where he became a Christian and was baptized. I came back to Kingston to write my master's thesis on slavery in Kingston and wrote Glenn regularly and visited Ronnie and his wife. I went out to British Columbia to visit Glenn in Matsui, which is in Abbotsford, where he transferred when he won his appeal, and his life sentence had been reduced from 21 to life to 14 to life. Glenn was later transferred to William Head Institution, which at the time was a medium institution over on Vancouver Island. So 9 years after we met, Glenn and I were married inside William Head on June the 21st, 1987. The guards had a bet going that our marriage would not last and that Glenn would leave me once he got out of prison. Not that there was not validity in their hypothesis. Many people who've gotten married inside prison have split from the spouse in 2 years or so after release. Glenn and I remained married for 32 years, however, until he died of lung cancer on October the 26th, 2019. Glenn's release from prison was slow and gradual. He was a chronic offender who had offended multiple times and returned to prison with a life sentence. He transferred from William Head to Ferndale Institution, which is now known as Mission Minimum here in Mission in 1988, and made day parole from the site in 1990. We lived in Mission, where I reside until this day, and Glenn until he died. When Glenn got out first, he cooked at a neighborhood bar while working on his bachelor's degree, and I worked on my PhD, adult basic education inside provincial prisons. In June 1991, Glenn and I made plans to go back to Kingston to see my family. I was presenting a paper on 19th century African Canadian women in British Columbia and Toronto. So we made plans to see our friend Ronnie and his wife in a small community. They lived outside of Toronto. After dinner, when the guys were walking outside, Ronnie's wife told me about how he'd been back in prison 3 times in the 10 years he'd been out, that he'd been wired on dope, and could he come home to live with us and get straightened out. Ronnie got out to us in his car in September of that year. I told him that he was welcome to stay, but he could not be doing dope or drinking inside the house or having the cops come to our door as Glenn was getting out. We had lots of time together, talking about his childhood, where he'd been sexually abused by the woman who raised him and her Johns. His father, he told me his father had killed his mother. We talked about music and so on. He had girlfriends but never brought them home. But in November, Glenn and I went to see Glenn's parents on Vancouver Island. Ronnie stayed at our house. The cops are called, as he said his car was stolen from the house. It had not been stolen. So when I was home with him, I told him that he needed to go back to Ontario. I talked to his wife, who got a ticket for him. I drove him out to the Vancouver airport and left him there a half an hour before the plane left. He did not go. 2 days later, on a Sunday morning, Glenn saw Ronnie's car at the Bellevue Hotel in Mission. He went to see him. Ronnie was sober. He told Glenn that he was going to kill someone. Glenn started to cry and told our friend that if he knew what he was making Glenn do. He pleaded with Ronnie and said, "No, don't do this. If you're going to kill somebody, kill me." Not me, Sherry, but himself, Glenn. But Ronnie didn't listen, and Glenn finally left. Glenn phoned a friend of ours, Jerry Ayotte, who phoned the police. Ronnie was picked up. He phoned the house, and I told him why we'd called the cops. I told him, "Ronnie, you said you're going to kill somebody, so I had to have you picked up." Ronnie was kept in Matsqueak for 2 months. He was then released with no conditions. He got home to his wife. And within the next month, one night, he slit his wrist. He told his wife he was fine. He asked her to pour him a bath. She did. Then went looking for him. He was dead, hanging from the rafters in their basement. It was devastating. This was an experience that Glenn and I never forgot. We never really talked about it. Our friend did not feel seen or heard. The fact that he did time was never spoke of, even though he was on parole for the rest of his natural life. His identity as a Black man was hidden to the point that people were told he was Spanish. He had no counseling for the severe sexual abuse he suffered as a child after his mother had been murdered. Heavily addicted, he was not made to go into treatment. But more than anything, Ronnie did not have a place to belong, where he was part of a pro-social community where he was accepted. So Glenn and I, trying to figure out what we were going to do, just formed LINC as a way to honor a friend. We see LINC as a community where all people impacted by criminal justice system belong. And we believe that everybody has something to give. We believe that people need to be accountable for their shit. LINC is a peer-based program. We also are one where we're not an us and a them. We work in conjunction with the Correctional Service of Canada, with the community. We work at meeting people at their point of need. Glenn had a number of sayings that he'd always be saying. So some of them are, Glenn would say, you'd never fail until you quit trying. So he would tell the people that we work with to keep trying, because for instance, as a lifer, people would often go back on a technical violation at least 2 or 3 times within the course of their sentence. And another thing Glenn was saying is he believed in community work, volunteer work in the community. Because what he used to say was, you're less likely to rob and steal in a community where you have a vested interest. So with LINC, when you're a member of LINC, you belong and are part of us unless you don't want to be. And another thing is that we're very open about who we are. One of the things Eddy said is, I got the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, and I can remember I wrote to Ann Kelly, who at the time was our senior deputy commissioner, is now our commissioner. And I said, the next time somebody tells you that prisoners' families bring down the neighborhood, you tell them that we contribute to our community, to our town, to our province, or to our country. So I wrote that and sent that to Anne. Glenn said, well, you're a bit ego-centered. And I said, no, Glenn, why I'm doing it is that you and I were out. We get to speak for our people, the people that done time, or the people who are family members. And I said, family members often don't have or feel scared about saying who they are and who they're attached to. And this is a way that I can say something and stand for my sisters and my family, my people. And how my life changed. When I said that my life changed, well, obviously I got involved in doing stuff around prisons, but also that I learned that prisoners were people, that prison staff were people, and the people that worked out in the wider community with prisoners. I also have really felt about the fact that people who've been crimes have been committed against again were people. I think now all the time about the people who've been offended against. And so one of the things I learned at school was that I accept and acknowledge that the greatest revolutionary tool is to acknowledge the humanity of the other. So I wanted to show you some pictures, I don't know if they're up, of Glenn and I and Ronnie and everyone. And then I now want to show you a video after that, a video of Emma's Acres that was done in 2018 by SFU. And I also want to say about how it was a real privilege that in 2018, Glenn spoke at the Corrections and Prisons Association conference in Montreal, Quebec, and we were part of on Emma's Acres, and that we were part of the best practices in Canada section. And what was really ironic and really special was the fact that that was the same hotel that Glenn stayed at when he was unlawfully at large after he committed his index offense. And he told that to the people that were there. But so some of the pictures here, you can see first, there's a picture of Glenn with a watermelon, and the watermelon is some of the produce from Emma's Acres. And then at the very top are the directional poles. The picture was taken by Randy Scott, who is retired, who was a deputy warden. He's on our board. Randy, that's another thing. I think he's also on the call. So we have everybody involved in our board, but the picture that he took of the directional pole was of a medicine garden that we have at Emma's Acres. The medicine garden is in honor of our friend Georgina Pappen, who was murdered by Willie Picton. And so it is a medicine garden with traditional medicines. There is a letter there from that said when we got permission for Glenn and I to get married inside prison. And then finally at the bottom there's a picture of me, and that's a picture of me with Ronnie, our friend Ronnie. And I think that is it. So I'd like to go now, if possible, to the video that was done by SFU communication students on Emma's Acres so that you could get an idea of how we work. The Emma's Acres video, please.
This is Emma's Acres in Mission, where people come here on their own free will. They haven't got shackles on or anything. They get to choose what they want to do, but they want to do it. They want to do it because they're helping people. They haven't had that opportunity. They haven't had that chance to act sorry. And this gives them a chance. And so I really believe that this is a whole paradigm shift, that we have on the verge of making a difference in the way we deal with criminal justice. Our idea was to bring people out of prison to the food exchange to work at the food exchange, and instead of paying them, they'd donate their time so that the profit would all go to victims. What's great about farming is it's constantly a new, something different happening. And so you get people from prison who are so used to being institutionalized, so routine, so regimented, and they come here and all of a sudden there's all this stuff that happens, and then it's not even predictable. It might not happen the same next year. So it's just such a wonderful experience for them, right? They really get an understanding that life isn't that routine, that's what happens to people. They go into prison, they get so into that routine, they get addicted to it. Prison is a kind of an addiction. And so lots of people go back to prison when they get out because they feel more comfortable in prison, believe it or not. I've had about 100 guys go through here, and I think maybe at most 3 people that got out after they were working here have come back to jail. So that's like 90% of the people that come here, get out, and haven't come back yet. So this is a really good, real model of what life is, right? This is life, right? It's growing things. And so again, I believe it really helps guys and women to kind of just see how their routine can be challenged and how they can feel uncomfortable but challenge that comfort zone and get stuff growing, and and something happens, right? One of the things we're always trying to find, and we'll get to that when we get back down that way, is getting people here from the community. That's the other really big aspect of this, is we have a lot of community people dropping in here, and it really makes people that are in prison feel like they're doing something important because these people are coming here, right? So it really means something to them. It's really symbolically a great thing for them to feel. It's the core of restorative justice is the community and the offenders working to help heal the harm that was caused by whatever happened to them, right? So if a victim, per se, came and said, well, I want all the kale that's in that field right now, we'd harvest it all. That one victim could take it all. Whatever they want when they come, that's what they get. If we got it, they get it. I'm not really a restorative justice person exactly. I'm more a transformative justice. A woman named Ruth Morris, you should look her up. She was an amazing woman, Quaker, and she used to talk about transformative justice, not restorative justice. You can't, especially when you talk about homicide, you can't restore that. The person's dead, right? And I understand that. I feel that. But we do need to transform that tragedy into something that's not just grief, not just anger and seeking revenge. We need to make that important. That person's life was important. And by making it something that's all about hate and revenge, we've really not put the value that we should on that life. We need to encourage people to do that. And that's what restorative justice really means to me. this is the totem pole. Actually, this is the victim totem pole. So every totem on that represents a victim. So this is in memory of them. The very top one is after Emma's Acres, or which we were called. She was a very dear friend of mine. She was a minister, and she was murdered. And so we dedicated the farm, and she's the top of the totem, right? She was a good friend of my grandfather's, actually, but my grandfather owned a jewelry store, and my mom inherited it. And so she used to come into the jewelry store, and I'm about 8 years old, I think, if I remember. I started meeting her, and I started going to her Sunday school. And then I started getting into trouble, and she used to come and see me in prison, and she used to write me letters and Christmas cards. She was kind of like my surrogate grandmother. I've been married before, and she married me to my first wife. She baptized my kids, and so we were very close. She was just a wonderful, wonderful, beautiful woman, eh? And somebody broke in one night. I don't think they expected her there. He was drunk, and he ended up killing her. So I do feel the same, I think, pain. I don't, push that, but I understand how victims feel, because I think that loss to me was like I lost somebody that was like a family. Right? She was very important to me. In fact, I just became a Christian in '82, and I'd written her and told her I'd become a Christian. She was so overjoyed, and then a year later, she died. I wasn't sure I wanted to get out of jail. I'd found something in prison that I never had in the street. I was good at helping people. I was good at caring about people, and I was allowed to do that because I was a Christian, right? When I was a prisoner, when I was a convict, I couldn't do that. You're supposed to stab people, not love them, right? So I could do that too. I did that when I was a prisoner, but I became a Christian, and I changed my whole approach to life and people and everything, and I found some huge meaning in that. So when she was killed, it really hurt me. I was really, sad and upset about it. And incredibly, this young guy, he was only 17 when he killed her, ended up getting sent to that prison where I was. So I was a victim who could have killed him, but I knew that's not what she would have wanted. And I was a Christian, and I had to live by that. I had to forgive and care about the people that harmed me too. And so I kind of didn't say anything to him, but I, kind of stayed out of his way. And then these Christian guards that saw me as a Christian leader there came to me and told me about this young kid who was illiterate and who they thought was going to have some problems, and if I could look out for him. And then I got transferred to Mission Minimum, which was called Ferndale at that time, and he came there. So he's like he was following me around, right? So he came, and by that time I'd started helping people get out of prison on parole. I'd been an assistant at a bunch of people's parole hearings. So when this kid showed up in Ferndale, his sentence was life originally, but he'd been reduced to 9 years, and so I knew he should have had a chance for parole by the time he got to at Ferndale. And so I asked him about that, and he told me that they hadn't given him a parole, and I told him, well, gee, maybe you should talk to me. I know a little bit about parole. And he said, well, maybe, I'm not sure. And he went away, but then a couple of weeks later, he came back and asked me if I could help him. So I told him, well, I'll meet you tonight in this very private location in the jail, and we'll talk. And so I got there, and I told him, and he knew. Somehow he'd found out, even though I hadn't told very many people. Somebody told him what was going on with me and him, and he started crying and told me how sorry he was. And I really believed him, and I worked with him there, and finally we went up for parole, and he got parole, and the parole board afterwards told me they wouldn't give him a parole if it wasn't for me. And so I know that's what she would have wanted. You see, that's what I really believe, that victims need to be thought about, right? So not just the survivors, but the victim. And what would the victim want? And maybe there are victims that would want somebody that killed them to be killed or punished. But I'd suggest to you there's an awful lot of people that are killed that really wouldn't want that. They wouldn't really want to cause that pain to the guy's family or the woman's family, or they wouldn't want to participate in that. And so, I had the opportunity to really experience that and really feel just the beauty of love and of how, forgiveness and compassion for those that have done you wrong can free you, not hate, not revenge. Those are just things that burn you up. I used to think that's what I had to do to survive, and then when I became a Christian, I realized that's not what you need to do to survive. That's killing you. And it's not helping anybody. So, again, I believe that we get that message through here to people, right? That we live that right here every day.
Thank you.
You.
So I'd
So
like
I'd
to
like to
just
just
again to
again to
acknowledge
acknowledge
the work of my late husband, Glenn, who you saw there. And this again is one of the things that Project LINC does in honor of our friend Ronnie Grant. And then, yeah, thanks again for listening.
Thank you, Sherry. What a great presentation and such an amazing video as well. I think we're ready to transition to our next speaker. Eddy, would you mind doing the introductions?
Certainly. We have now with us Dr. Wendy VanderWal Martin, who is the Associate Director of CoSA Canada. Grounded in restorative justice, CoSA aims to reduce sexual victimization by assisting people who've been convicted of a sexual offense to lead responsible, constructive, and accountable lives in their communities. CoSA runs 15 sites across Canada, serving 200 plus core members annually. The program has expanded internationally, and it was founded in my hometown of Hamilton, Ontario. Joining Wendy is Cristina Abasolo, who is the coordinator of CoSA Vancouver Fraser Valley. She also is a volunteer at CoSA and the communications lead. So I will turn it over to Wendy and Cristina.
Well, we're grateful for this opportunity, and I'm actually joining you from New Brunswick in Canada, and grateful to be an uninvited guest on the traditional territories of the Passamaquoddy people who are here in New Brunswick and Maine. And with that acknowledgement, I'm grateful to begin our presentation. Thank you to Cristina, who's joining me, and who is from the Vancouver area and will bring some local stories of CoSA's work right there in BC. CoSA began, Circles of Support and Accountability began in Canada, as Eddy mentioned, in the city of Hamilton, with someone who had been convicted several times of sexual offenses and was at warrant expiry, ready to be released into the community in the mid-90s. And that was much to the outcry of the community around them. And so a Mennonite pastor spirited him away into the community and began to surround this individual with a circle of volunteers who would both support and hold accountable so that that individual could remain out of incarceration and begin to learn and grow and experience transformation. So CoSA allows the community to play a direct role in the restoration, the reintegration, and risk management practices. Now, of course, the population of those who have been convicted of sexual offenses are a particularly challenging population in terms of reintegration, and the stigma and the lack of public education around their own experiences and stories about recidivism as it relates to this population, and about some of the things that we have learned about reintegration programming over the years that programs like CoSA have been in place. And so our volunteers come from a variety of walks of life. Sometimes they're from policing or corrections or criminology, but it could be a pastor, it could be a therapist, it could be a librarian, it could be a plumber, it could be someone who has a loved one who's incarcerated and now wants to give back through CoSA. And so our volunteers are trained both in terms of coming into the program, but also ongoing professional development for our volunteers. They're screened, of course, and they bring a variety of life skills, experience, training, but they're not there as professionals. So if one of our volunteers is a therapist, they're not functioning in the circle around the core member as a therapist. They're there as a community member and role model. One of our volunteers from the Ottawa area said that she was a practice friend for her core member. And I think that was a really interesting metaphor to say there are certain boundaries that we have in place because of the nature of this program, but you get to practice what it would be like to develop a friendship in which there are no secrets, in which there's deep, vulnerable sharing for the purposes of both supporting and holding to account an individual who has set goals to lead a crime-free life. And so this support and this accountability is crucial as core members begin to unpack their time in institutions, to unpack the harm that they have caused those who they have victimized, as they begin to recognize some of their patterns and behaviors, and as they look at their strengths and skills and begin to set goals. Our volunteers do work closely with CoSA staff, and so part of that accountability is paying attention to any concerns that might arise, and if necessary, report that to authorities. And so while CoSA is not part of the corrections system, our volunteers choose to be there. And so our core members have a very different sort of experience of some level of supervision and connection than they do from correctional services. CoSA does work closely as a partner with our correctional partners in community. Cristina.
Thank you, Wendy. Hello, everyone. I'm humbled to be joining you today from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in Vancouver. Thank you for having me today. CoSA's mission is to substantially reduce the risk of future sexual victimization by assisting and supporting released individuals in their task of reintegrating into the community and leading a responsible, meaningful, and accountable life. Our goal is to keep our community safe by building community. We assign 3 to 4 volunteers to build a circle of support around each core member or a released person who had been convicted of at least one sexual crime. We serve to decrease sexual reoffending through circles where volunteers build genuine relationships with released offenders. CoSA circles address the root causes and risk factors of reoffending by holding released offenders accountable for their decisions and actions. We are inclusive. CoSA is for everyone regardless of ethnicity, sexuality, gender, religion, ability, or identity. Potential core members who acknowledge that they're at risk to reoffend and who have a genuine desire to live crime-free lives are invited to participate. CoSA welcomes all released individuals who have been convicted of at least one sexual offense, who accept and acknowledge that they are at high risk to reoffend, and who make a commitment to be part of their CoSA circle for at least a year. Most circles last longer than this. They range in age from 20s to 80s. They come from all gender identities, all different ethnicities. They may be faith or non-faith oriented. For many, the circle is their only source of friendship, support, and real human connection.
The restorative objectives of CoSA include building safer and healthier communities. We want to enable our core members to take responsibility for the harm they have caused, including choices they have made along the way. CoSA is deeply committed to generating an environment of empathy so that we better understand the needs of victims and the impact of sexual harm on them. We, of course, recognize that many of our core members were victims of sexual offenses themselves as children or as adults.
Wendy, could I just interrupt you and ask you to speak up just a little bit? The audio is a bit soft.
Okay, is this better?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eddy. And again, we want to ensure that people understand that though some circles will be heavier on support and some circles may be heavier on accountability, each circle under the supervision of CoSA staff are attentive to ensuring that those two aspects of our work are well integrated. And so we want to support our core members in developing new and positive life strategies. One of the ways we do that is to use the Good Lives model and bring that into the circle conversations week to week.
Yes.
Cristina.
Thank you, Wendy. Wendy and I are here to tell you that truly CoSA works. There have been many evidence-based studies that have been conducted here in Canada and around the world. And in varying contexts, these studies consistently show similar results. There's always a reduction in recidivism or reoffending among core members who were able to participate in a CoSA circle. In Canadian studies, we've seen consistently that participants in CoSA circles committed between 70 to 83% fewer reoffenses. A 2018 study out of Minnesota showed that those who participated in CoSA circles reduced their sexual recidivism by a huge number of 88%. And I'm going to add here as well, there was a study in the UK in 2007 that showed an even more dramatic result where in the category of sexual and violent crimes, recidivism was almost at a 0%. And so that was pretty powerful. So I'll show you this one graph here. Like I said, there are many studies, but this particular graph here done through the Correction Service of Canada in 2007 is pretty representative of the studies that have come out. The results are fairly consistent. You'll see here in the category of reoffending in.
Cristina, I think your audio is not working.
So let me just pick up for Cristina. We'll see.
Participated. Sorry.
You're back. You were frozen.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Should I go over the numbers again?
Just the chart. Yes.
Chart. Okay. Sorry about that. You know, here in Vancouver, we're preparing for snow, 10 centimeters. So you can imagine how panicky the people are. So maybe that's why.
I wouldn't doubt it.
All right, so this particular chart here is pretty representative of many of the studies that have been made in the years past, where it shows a consistency in a decrease in sexual recidivism. In sexual recidivism, for example, we see about 83% less reoffending. In violent recidivism, we see 73% less. And in reoffending of any kind, 71% in general recidivism among individuals who have the benefit of participating in a CoSA circle. So the numbers are pretty powerful. The numbers show that truly community-based involvement in offering support and holding core members accountable truly works in keeping our community safe.
Thank you, Cristina. I do just want to mention as well that we are more than happy to send a complete bibliography with many of the research studies that provides the evidence-based support for a program like CoSA. In Canada, our operations have been running since the mid-90s, but we were very grateful to be part of a capacity building project through Public Safety Canada that started in 2017. And because of that funding, we were able to develop a very consistent operational model. And we have seen the growth of CoSA globally. And so perhaps many of our participants on the webinar today from countries other than Canada will know that there's CoSA running in your nation as well. Right now, there is not one operational model for all of CoSA worldwide. However, there is a regular sharing of best practices. In late August, I was able to be part of the annual general meeting of Circles Europe and got to know some of the leaders from various countries in that European Union and context as well. But in Canada, we have been able to bring a strong consistency and to develop what really have become the best practices after 20 years of operation. All the CoSA sites have now these common standards. They're met and maintained nationwide. We're we're actually more than happy to share with you our good practice manuals that we have developed for both volunteers and for staff. We'll be sharing our contact information at the end of the webinar, and you can email and ask for those manuals. It certainly, I think, goes to continue to build credibility with our corrections partners and our community partners as we work with a challenging population. I will say, however, that it's really important to us at CoSA Canada that all of our 15 sites across the country have the opportunity to contextualize their work in their own local reality. And so we have a consistent operational model that affords flexibility for people to adapt and to be ensure that in living into restorative justice, that relationship and contextualization is prioritized. Of course, we've been emphasizing throughout our whole presentation that this is an integration of both support and accountability. And so circles act as a hub in helping our core members access the needed supports and resources. In the early phase of a circle, that will likely be the more essential needs like housing or employment. As they go along, it may be mental health supports, addiction or recovery supports, and along the way, it could be more personal growth and personal transformation. We're looking to partner with something called the Prison Enneagram Project, which looks at our personality and how we can grow and become more self-aware and increase in self-regulation. We support very honest discussion through establishing clear boundaries. And it is the golden rule of our circles that no secrets are kept. We honor shared goals and commitments by promoting trust and respect between the core members and the volunteers. That this really becomes like a model, or like our volunteer in Ottawa said, a practice friend circle. It is an opportunity for that core member to learn communication skills, to process interpersonal conflict, to learn how to reestablish trust if and when trust might be broken. So circles assist their core members in managing their personal risk factors, whatever those may be, and those emerge through the context of those circle conversations. It recognizes their strengths and provides strong affirmation of those strengths. Sometimes maybe the first opportunity a core member has to really be affirmed for what contribution they have to offer. But they also develop new skills, and as I said earlier, self-understanding that can lead to increased and mature emotional self-regulation. All of this combines to breaking the cycle of offending and preventing victimization and sexual harm, which of course contributes to community safety and also to that core member making a positive community contribution.
Thank you, Wendy. So I'll share a little bit about how our local site here, CoSA Vancouver Fraser Valley, came to be. We started in 2003 when we started with a few circles for core members released from the federal institutions. And in 2016, we expanded to include those released from provincial. In 2019, with the onset of the pandemic, we started the virtual circles. I think we're on to the next one now, Wendy.
I'm sorry, Cristina, my laptop's doing crazy things.
Oh, that's okay. I'll just talk through it then.
Thank you.
We introduced virtual circles. I'm just going to open up my own copy here. All right. And we were able to offer circles virtually to individuals released into communities where we may not have enough volunteers to start in-person circles, and so we were able to do that virtually. And this really took us to the next level, because then a lot of barriers were broken in the sense that we now have volunteers who build circles around individuals here in British Columbia, but volunteers come from as far as Ontario, and so it's no longer just a local effort, but it's like a nationwide effort. So the virtual circles have really been very helpful, and we've expanded to include all of BC and the Yukon. At any given time, we have between 35 and 40 operational circles serving that many core members, supported by over 90 volunteers. This does not take into account the number of released or soon to be released offenders who are on the wait list, waiting for a circle, requesting for a circle to be opened up for them, which unfortunately we're not always able to offer them due to limitations in budget and manpower. So from the beginning in 2003 to now, we have had over 250 circles, most of them successful, not all of them that successful, but a lot of core members have benefited from the circles over the years. Of course, our work is only possible because of a cooperative relationship with multiple community partners, such as the police forces, parole and probation offices. It truly is a testament to how building community can lead to a safer community, how it takes a village or community to help just one released offender to not reoffend and to be able to lead a more responsible and purposeful life. It is a testament to how we as community members can really help each other heal, grow, and be responsible members of society. After all, no one is disposable, and everyone deserves a second chance, or maybe even a third or fourth chance at building a meaningful life.
Thank you so much, Cristina. There are some challenges that CoSA Canada is facing. As I mentioned, we were so grateful for a capacity building project through Public Safety Canada, but it ended in March 2022. That grant was providing $1.5 million on average annually. And so with the end of that kind of 5-year project, it's a massive impact on a program like CoSA, working again with a very particular population. And so this lack of secure long-term funding, sustainable funding, has the capacity to jeopardize the ability of local sites to continue to receive new core members. And so waiting lists are increasing. One of the challenges is that some of our psychotherapist supports and mentors have said that a disrupted circle could cause more harm than help. And so we want to be very wise in launching new circles as some of our sites struggle for funding. This does mean that we've been working very hard, and we're very grateful for some of the regional offices of Correctional Services Canada, through whom we are developing some short-term contracts, hopefully to help us move through this particular phase. And we are continuing to hope that at the federal level in Canada, that the federal framework to reduce recidivism, its implementation plan, might have some sustainable funding that will help CoSA continue to play this critical role in the community as a bit of a go-between between our correctional services and the community in which our core members seek to reintegrate. Of course, we always need more volunteers, and two of the areas that CoSA Canada is mandated to contribute to, but has been spending so much time fundraising, we still need to move more dramatically in these areas, is ongoing advocacy for our core members and also public education that would address some of the misinformation and some of the stigma that makes reintegration particularly challenging for our core members. I also did just want to leave you with a hopeful word, and that is to really celebrate and let you know about the amazing creativity and innovation that our CoSA staff across Canada have. Right now, we are working with the Department of Justice in Canada on a victim lens project. That's to ensure that the experience of victims and survivors, their needs and their expectations of a reintegration program like CoSA, is part of our governance, part of our programming, that we'll develop a victims advisory council to ensure that that's always in front of us, and that linkage, again, with our commitment to restorative justice, that victims' voices are heard. We're very grateful again to Public Safety Canada. We're currently piloting a new core member needs and strengths tool, and this is going to increase the depth and richness of conversations that happen in our circles, and in particular, be able to have some measure of the kind of growth and transformation that our core members experience. Currently, I'm working on a project that will develop our virtual circles more. The pandemic, of course, was a very difficult challenge for CoSA, but one of the good things coming out of the pandemic was that we began to experiment with virtual circles. In-person circles are always preferred, but if someone can have a virtual circle rather than no circle, we want to see that expand and grow. Very quickly, our Toronto CoSA site is also piloting a wonderful program called Guiding Good Choices that is actually for those who are pre-offense, that is a little bit more of a triangle than a circle, where a peer who has been incarcerated for a sexual offense is put together with a CoSA staff person and the person who's pre-offense. And we're finding very good results, both with that core member, but also with the sentencing process that is looking at that GGC program as a way to intervene and put a potential incarcerated person on the right path. We're also doing some supplementary programming around peer fellowship nights where core members are gathering together with CoSA staff. And so CoSA continues to innovate and be creative, as well as really understanding that our circle program is the evidence-based work that we know can contribute to public safety. We want to thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we didn't go over our time too much, but again, this is the email address to send to if you would like either the bibliography of further research on CoSA, a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, or our good practice manuals for staff or volunteers. VanderWal@CoSACanada.com. Eddy, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that. That was excellent, very, very informative presentation. I learned quite a lot, and I put a few questions in the chat window about the research around CoSA, so I'll let you think about that. And I think our next speaker, we may also have a few words to say, because I believe she researches, among many other tasks, researches the effectiveness of CoSA programs in the UK. So Swayam, I'll turn it over to you to introduce Dr. Belinda Winder.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Wendy and Cristina, for that presentation. Our next guest is Dr. Belinda Winder. Dr. Winder is a professor of forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University, UK. Dr. Winder is the researcher of the Center of Crime Offending. She co-founded the Safer Living Foundation, which delivers and evaluates programs to prevent sexual reoffending and helps people with a sexual conviction reintegrate into the community. Dr. Winder's research includes the experiences of non-offending partners of those convicted of a sexual offense. We thank her for joining us at such a late hour in the UK. And so Dr. Winder, please take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. And can I just check you can see my slides?
Yes, I can.
Lovely. Okay. Yeah, it's just gone 9 p.m. here, and I don't know if England have qualified for past the group stage of the World Cup, but I will find out afterwards. Thanks very much. So,
Belinda, just quickly, can you expand the slides? We're only seeing about a smaller view. Just for,
yeah, I just
I think it should.
No, it's got the, has it still got the notes on?
Yes.
No, it just has like 2 slides showing, so I just want to see if we can fill up the whole screen.
Sure.
Slides.
Sure. Let me just.
Is that better?
There we go. Yes, perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, brilliant. All right. So yes, so wanted to talk today about the families of people who've been arrested for a sexual offence. And I've got just a couple of slides, and really I'm probably going to be doing more just talking through my material. But two things, I guess, 2 points I really wanted to make from this presentation. And one is, I think given the pandemic, we have all had a really good taste, certainly in the UK, of what social isolation does to us, how it impacts upon our mental and physical well-being. And I think in a way that we probably, very few of us really understood before. And so the sort of label social isolation is one of the places that people are left when they are a partner of someone arrested for a sexual offence, and indeed if they themselves are arrested for a sexual offence, but it's the families I'm focusing on today. So thinking about how families are left and what happens to them once an investigation starts. But I guess the first thing I really wanted to start with, and now my slides won't move along, is about language. So the language we use, and I've been hearing a kind of a sort of range of language today, and I guess what I would like to say is in the UK we're certainly trying to make efforts to really look at people-centered language, and so we're really trying to avoid language that really conflates a person with the act. So rather than using murderer or rapist, you know, we're trying not to tie the person into that act. We're trying not to, we're trying to use the person-centered language that allows people a kind of a future, allows people an identity that doesn't anchor them to a historical act that they've done, and probably the worst historical act they've done. And I sometimes try to get people to think of how this might feel to some small extent if you were to think about the worst thing you've ever done, or something you've done that you are ashamed of, embarrassed about, whether you have been very drunk one night, whether you have shoplifted, whether you have committed adultery, and how it would feel to be called as an adulterer, as a drunkard for the rest of your life. And that's the kind of the chain that goes around you. And so one of my pleas is that people start to really think about the language they use and what it does to people. And so avoiding the offender, even the ex-offender, and the sort of derogatory labels like deviant, criminal, delinquent, and starting to use language such as person with a conviction, person with a sexual conviction. And the reason I guess I have this kind of little mini rant about language is because using the kind of stigmatizing language that we all, you know, do and have done, it hurts us all. It hurts us because, and so the research, and again, like Wendy and Cristina, if anyone would like copies of the reference or the bibliography, I'd be very happy to provide them afterwards. But when we hear the words murderer, rapist, etc., compared to if we hear the phrase someone who's committed this or been convicted of this, biologically we're affected, neurophysiologically we're affected. So that increases in our brain, it increases our levels of fear, it increases our anger, it reduces our own well-being. So us hearing those terms, me, I haven't committed a murder, but if I hear those terms, they reduce my well-being. It also, of course, it impacts upon the people we're talking about. It chains them again, as I've said, to their kind of historical act, which could have been a one-off act, serious and severe, though it may well have been, and causing a lot of damage, but it ties them to that act. It stops people from volunteering. Circles, a fantastic initiative, and I was responsible for the national evaluation in the last few years of the UK circles of support, and absolutely agree with everything Wendy and Cristina said. Such a good initiative. But if you're looking at encouraging volunteers to help with circles of support, if you use language that rapist, sex offender, etc., rather than someone who's committed a sexual offence or been convicted of a sexual offence, then you are less likely to get volunteers. So it reduces public well-being, it reduces people's well-being, it reduces volunteering, it affects families and friends. So in no instance is language helpful. And actually, if you reduce the number of volunteers who will offer their help for the sort of services such as circles, then you're actually having an impact on reducing the sort of prevention of reoffending as well. So I guess language matters is where I'm coming from. So on to the families. So we know that internet-mediated sexual offences is rapidly growing. It's expanding. There's new types, the live streaming, from the downloading of images, the live streaming, the grooming, the coercion. And so more and more people are being affected. But there are a certain number of things about internet-mediated sexual offences that are a little bit different to the sort of contact sexual offences. And what we're finding is that while the number of people committing these offences are going up, many of these people have no previous criminal history. We have 30 to 40% of them approximately live in a household with children. People are typically employed, typically male, they have professional jobs, all levels of education. So we're now looking at a criminal investigation and a police investigation, starting with the knock on the door. And the knock on the door from the police could happen at any time of the day and night. And it means that the whole house is roused. Typically, it will happen when the children are at home, because the police, at the moment, the policy is that all the persons in the household need to be there. So if you imagine at 3 a.m, heavy knocking on the door, the police come in, they're searching the house, they're taking all the electronic devices, no one knows what's happening. It's a source of shock and stigma and distress to everyone in the family, and not something that the children in the household or the partner or the person who's being arrested are going to forget. And the protracted police investigations, in particular for internet sexual offences, which can be around 2 years, sometimes more, mean that everyone's living in some kind of limbo for a while. Now, one of the first things the police will do is to ascertain whether the person, the suspect, has been abusing the children they live with. And this is unlikely to be the case. And at this point, which of course, that's excellent, but it is unlikely to be the case. But it means that at that point, the children in the household are not formally considered to have been harmed in any way, and therefore they are not victims. So they're certainly not direct victims, but that means that they will not be able to access any of the sources of support that will be available to other people who have been harmed, to the direct victims. And so part of my presentation really is a plea that we need to think through the policy and the practice, the police, the social work, the people who look after and protect the children, the educational authorities. What happens in these investigations? What happens in these incidents? And how can the families and the children and the partners or ex-partners, how can they be supported and helped? Because that's not what happens at the moment. We have people who are thinking about the partner who is in shock and who is now trying to balance this awareness of the police are here, this is what my partner's accused of doing or has done, I need to look after the children. And I've got a couple of just perhaps 1 or 2 quotes from people I've spoken to is from research that I've published, that I guess hopefully bring it home to people. And someone said, never in my wildest imaginations or nightmares did I think I'd be in this situation ever. And it's like entering a different world. It's like being catapulted to outer space, but you just feel as though there's no help anyway. You've got your hands tied behind your back and you're in a darkened room, because this isn't my world. This has never been my world. And another one who said, it's like a bomb that goes off when you have no clue, no idea. And then this bomb goes off. It's like a grenade, and everything you've ever known goes up in the air. And it just takes all this time coming floating down, and it never gets put. You can't put those pieces back together again. That's how it is. That, you know, every family has some problems, but overall we're a very, very close family that looks after each other. We've gone from that to be just so far removed from that, you just wouldn't recognize it. And in looking at the kind of my study of the partners of people who have been arrested for a sexual offence, looking at levels of their well-being, looking at their levels of post-traumatic stress disorder, an average of 4 years after they received the knock, 75% of them met the criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So we are leaving a group of partners and ex-partners and children that we know that the whole wave of adverse childhood experiences coming on to hit those children. There's financial challenges with the person who's arrested losing their job. There's legal problems with civil liabilities. People often have to move house, move school. They can't tell friends and family. You know, the police will tell people, don't tell friends or family, because, you know, the word will get out, and then you'll get people coming to your house, vandalizing your house. Children can be bullied at school. Social work and probation will question the partner. How didn't you know? Why didn't you know? Why didn't you see the signs? Maybe you're part of this as well. And so there's a whole level of this courtesy stigma. So the stigma by association that people are subjected to, while at the same time they still have to work through their own feelings and emotions and betrayal and loss as well of what they've known. And so, and then the struggles continue. So how does someone manage their relationship with their partner or ex-partner? People are always so frightened that someone with a sexual offence will commit another offence, and yet the reoffending rate for sexual offences is very low. But in the public mind, in particular, perhaps spawned by the media and people's own fear and concern, we feel it's a high, you know, we think it's going to be a high risk, but it isn't. It's a very low risk of recidivism, probably only lower for people who've committed murder, really. But for children, there'll be particular challenges, not just ones for the parent who's trying to manage them and cope with them, but and do you tell the children? What do you tell the children? Do the children feel they're responsible in some way? Are they getting bullied at school? Do they worry that they have these genes, that they may end up doing this as well? How do you communicate such complexity to the children? And I've taken a quote from Michael Fito: the challenge for clinicians and policymakers is to distinguish those who are likely to sexually reoffend and those who are not. As I said, the reoffending rate is so very low that it's really quite difficult because the base rate is so low. And actually, the vast majority of people will not reoffend. And those people who are high risk, if they can benefit from something like circles of support, we've heard again how low that risk can be. But in the public minds, in people's minds, the risk is high, the fear is high, and the anger is high. But this has its own problems. It encourages people towards the kind of community notifications, the registration, the disclosure, none of which have any evidence that they're effective, but all of which increase fear and anxiety in everyone, in the public, And not only that, but they also act as barriers to the integration of people. In terms of support for partners and ex-partners, there's a few organisations such as Lucy Faithful, Children Heard and Seen, Talking Forward in the UK. And I just wanted to finish on actually some of the problems with some of the difficulties that these forums and groups find is that there's a division really between people who stay with their partner, those who don't stay with their partner. So everyone's trying to find their sort of position there, and I think people who stay with their partner perhaps have a tougher time because it's easier to kind of cut loose and say, I'm not part of, this person's not part of my life anymore. But for those who want to stay with their partner, it's much more of a balancing act. And another of the problems we found with the sort of forums is that people haven't realised all the different consequences of their partner's actions. So, for example, if their partner comes back to live with them with a criminal conviction, their house and contents insurance might be, I know, 5 or 6 times higher. They may become the target of the local neighbourhood. If people get to know who's living there, and there's a number of difficulties, and in the forums, finding out what you've got in store for you, people can find that even more upsetting than actually the support that they are getting from others in similar situations. So just a final word about what needs to happen. Well, we need to map out what the policy and the practice that should be in place to help provide support for partners, ex-partners and children. What are the gaps and inconsistencies? What about minority groups who might have more of a kind of a collective and a community feel? What about them? And the information reported by the media in the UK, pretty much all information is reported. There are some restrictions in terms of where children commit offences, but names of families can be reported, which means that actually that then triggers the having to move house, having to move school, having to change job, and the vandalism and the bullying, etc. So the picture for families is pretty bleak actually, and I think it's something we really need to start to focus on and to look at how we can improve you know, what we do and how we help families, whether the partners rejoin them or not. But it's the integration of people, not even reintegration, integration, perhaps with this new identity that people have, this new part of themselves that it is so difficult for people to live with. And that's Belinda, and let me just stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Belinda. I found that absolutely riveting, and it's very, very informative. And you thinking about a lot of things that I hadn't thought of before, particularly around language. And I often find myself struggling to use language, particularly in writing. Like there are phrases which are convenient to use, but I know when I read them back, they're just kind of, it's like, it is stigmatizing language, and it's, I think we do need to. And I just say, in terms of motivating those convicted of a sexual offense of joining something like CoSA, if people refer to them or they refer to themselves as sex offenders, I think that reduces the motivation. Right?
People do. I run some groups with people in prison with sexual conviction, and after a while, people started to stop using that language about themselves, and actually, which was really good. But you know, I think regardless of what people have kind of what label people have taken on, and regardless of word count, which sometimes is one of the things I'm struggling with in written documents. But it's to start saying someone, a person, and it's not like as if they're human, because we all are human. So it's not like human beings or as human beings. We are human beings, and it is someone with this, someone who has been convicted of this, otherwise we are just making them that person, that worst thing with, you know, who wants to be there, and what chance, what opportunity does that give you to you know, to become the kind of person who can contribute in some way to society, because you are always, you know, you're a rapist, you're a this, a that. So I try really hard now not to use the sort of anything other than label, the kind of someone with a.
Well, thank you so much for that. And I hopefully during the Q&A, and I hope we have time for it, people can raise some more questions about this if they like. I'm going to turn it over to Swayam now to introduce our final speaker from New Zealand.
Yeah, Dr. Winder, thank you so much for that powerful presentation, and I think a great segue into our next speaker, Corrina Thompson. She is the Senior Mentoring Coordinator at Pillars New Zealand. Pillars provides support and mentorship to children of people serving a sentence in the prison or community. These children are in a situation they did not choose, yet face a sentence of their own. They are invisible victims who may become socially and economically isolated. Corrina works with children in their homes and recently completed a master's degree on the lived experiences of people involved in the New Zealand justice system. She also started a youth advisory panel at Pillars and recently submitted an open letter to the New Zealand government calling for the establishment of children's care plans for all children of parents serving a sentence. So Corrina, please feel free to take the floor. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Swayam. I'm just going to share my screen to get us started. Can I just get a thumbs up from you, Swayam, that everyone can see my screen now?
Yep, we can see your screen.
Okay, brilliant, brilliant. Oh, kia ora, everybody. Greetings from down here in New Zealand. I would like to start by just acknowledging my fellow speakers. It's been amazing and really humbling to be part of this global conversation about transformative justice and the effective, well, the value, I should say, of effective community reintegration. As Swayam has said, I am the Senior Mentoring Coordinator for Pillars here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we are a charity who support children and their whānau of people in prison as well as those serving a community-based sentence. My role as a Senior Mentoring Coordinator sees me as a frontline practitioner working alongside our young people, as well as dabbling in youth development, program development, and also in research. My master's thesis included interviews from our own Pillars whānau, which led me to a conclusion around the idea that public opinion is an underestimated barrier when it comes to transformative justice throughout the world, and in particular here in New Zealand as well. Oh, just a moment. So just briefly over the next sort of 20 minutes, just what we will be talking about today in my presentation. I am well aware that everyone, likely all the participants, all of my fellow guests have got a wealth of knowledge and expertise when it comes to the challenges of the justice system, in particular for this cohort around life offenders or people with a sex offence. And what I would like to offer is the unique lens that I feel privileged to have, and that is the frontline narratives from our children who are impacted by this, by having parents in prison, and in particular having parents in prison who have a lifetime offence or a sexual offence. So just a trigger warning, the 4 case studies that I will be sharing with you do have mention of child abuse, in particular family violence and sexual violence. And I will wrap us up with the evidence-based calls that our young people and we as Pillars are calling for transformation in the justice system here in New Zealand. So who is Pillars? Who are we and what do we do? We're a charity that works primarily with the families and children on the outside. There are other organisations that work with with people in prison, but our role sees us working with mums, dads, nanas, caregivers, foster providers, and the children out in their homes. I've made this, I'm a person who likes to think in pictures, so I've made us this metaphor of a tree. Our two core programs are our social work support and our mentoring program. The whānau social work, or the family social work support that we offer, is in-house, out in the community, in people's living rooms, where they feel safe. When someone reaches out to Pillars for support, the first person that they will meet is one of our social workers, who will meet them in their home where they are. Our social workers, who are all Māori, who are all Indigenous or Pacifica, will work from a strengths-based approach that recognises A, the courage it's taken to reach out for support through Pillars, and B, working alongside families to help them set goals for themselves, help them become agents of their own success in a non-judgmental and very people-centered way. Because of the over-representation in the New Zealand justice system of our Indigenous Māori family, it's really important that we as an organisation work through a tikanga Māori lens. That's a Māori worldview, Māori protocols and practices, and Māori core values that really guide our work. Once our social workers feel that they have wrapped that support around a family to the point that there has been enough stability to take place, they then do a referral to myself and my colleagues on the mentoring program, where we match a young person with a volunteer mentor, someone we like to call an askable adult or a positive role model, who will spend a minimum of a year, but in the vast majority of cases, it's several years, walking alongside that young person, helping them to reach their potential. Just to give you guys some context for New Zealand, because I think New Zealand, we like to we have this global representation that we're this small, clean and green country, and that we're a very safe country. And in many ways we are, but there is a stark reality here about some confronting statistics that happen behind closed doors. New Zealand has very high statistics when it comes to family violence, sexual violence, child homicide and youth suicide. We also have that really high prison population per capita. There was a time recently when we were sitting at just second under the United States when it comes to prison population for our size of country. And of our prison population, there is a huge overrepresentation, as I've mentioned, of our Māori family. It was recently outed in New Zealand's media that Māori women are now among the most imprisoned Indigenous populations in the world. Speaking to our Canadian guests, I know that it will come as no surprise. Many of you will know that your own prison population is around 30% Indigenous First Nations, yet only 4 or 5% of your general population. For us here in New Zealand, just over half of our prison population is Māori, yet our general population is only made up of around 15% of Māori families. That is why it is really important that we as a frontline organisation are led by a Māori-based worldview, where we meet families face to face and walk alongside them in a mana enhancing way, or a self-worth, self-esteem enhancing way. Very recently, taking all of this into account, New Zealand brought in a new justice strategy called Hokairangi, which for the first time has admitted in black and white that there is systemic racism and bias that exists in our justice system. There is also Hokairangi's kind of a fundamental idea is that we are trying to create a justice system that focuses on well-being and holistic intervention that includes children and families. However, I need to amplify the voices of our children and families when I say that whether it's something to do with the pandemic and the timing of the introduction of Hokairangi, the intentions of Hokairangi is not what is being felt in terms of service delivery here on the ground, neither in prisons and neither out in the community for the families of people in prison. When it comes to the cohort that we are talking about today around lifetime offending and sex offending, I thought it was really relevant just to give some statistics for New Zealand, again, because I think people might find them quite surprising. Here in New Zealand, these statistics come from our Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. I have all of the a link to any of my references at the end if anyone would like them. Here in New Zealand, 1 in 3 women will experience sexual violence in her lifetime, and 1 in 8 men. And of those, fewer than 10% of sexual offences are ever reported to police. And of that 10% that do get reported, only 1 in 8 will ever lead to a conviction. So that wedge, that green wedge that you see at the bottom of your screen, 20% of our people in prison who are serving time for a sexual offence really do represent the tip of the iceberg. And I say that not to create, as Dr. Belinda was saying, not to create a fear and a stigma, but to really underline the level of need when it comes to this discussion around strengthening communities, strengthening prevention and intervention, rather than pouring endless amounts of resource into the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, that being the prison system or the justice system. My research thesis really looked at this level of need in contrast to the lack of support. And just as building on what Dr. Belinda was saying, what I believe that public opinion is an underappreciated barrier because of its power to play a huge role in the political sphere. We are constantly locked here in New Zealand in this debate of whether we need to be tougher on crime or softer on crime, and what's called penal populism. And all the while the two sort of major parties argue about what the best thing to do is, we lock ourselves into this cycle of a status quo, and no effective justice reform takes place, meaning that the harm that is perpetuated by the justice system and the lack of support out in the community means that that harm becomes intergenerational, and it starts to compound and build upon itself. I've put here again from our Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group the social cost, but also the fiscal cost of our prison system here in New Zealand. It's a near $1 billion industry annually, as you can see from that top black line in that graph. But I'd like to draw your attention down to second from the bottom up, support for victims, around 11 million, support for families of people in prison and support for the families of victims doesn't even register on this graph. And I think it really speaks volumes when it comes to the expectation that we have as a society around who is involved in the justice system and where their needs might be. All of this being said, something that I would like to, a seed I guess I would like to plant with you all today is the analogy of the cliff when it comes to compounding risk. We've all heard about this analogy with the fence being at the top of the cliff, the ambulance being at the bottom. I'd like you to imagine yourselves standing at the edge of this cliff and looking at the fence and imagining that each railing on the fence represents things like the education system, the housing system, access to healthcare, access to community supports. And as we know, in underserviced communities, most of these preventative measures are overworked and under-resourced. So let's metaphorically just smash out some of these, it's a significant number of these fence palings and expose big gaps. So if you're a young person who finds yourself at the edge of this cliff, there is a high chance that you will meet one of these gaps and fall off. Now, once you're in free fall, as you're falling, not only was there nothing really there to stop you from falling, but now that you're falling, there's no tree roots, there's no ledges, there's no footholds for you to reach out and grab onto to slow yourself down, let alone to stop yourself. That is a metaphor for us for the lack of interventive supports, the real lack when it comes to mental health, when it comes to addiction support, when it comes to family violence. For many of our families, they are trying to reach out in free fall and just finding that there's nothing there. And what this means is that all of these adverse childhood experiences, many of which we will be familiar with there on the screen, they start to build and compound on each other, and they end up ricocheting back out into the community when people hit that ambulance at the bottom at full force, rather than having been able to slow themselves down or not fall at all. What this means for our pillars families is that they are navigating very complex and challenging circumstances. As Swayam was saying, the term invisible sentence was actually coined by our former president, Dr. Liz Gordon, who's done some amazing research for children of prisoners here in New Zealand. That the idea that when someone goes to prison, seldom are the children in the forefront of the justice system's mind, let alone in the public's mind, of the sentence that they will serve out in the community that's one of trauma, of adversity, of challenge, stigma, and grief. And that's whether or not they have any relationship with the person who's in prison. anyone in New Zealand who has a parent in prison is now around 9.5 times more likely to be incarcerated one day themselves, because of these compounding risks that gain strength in numbers from their adverse childhood experiences. These 4 pie graphs on the bottom here are actually from a live piece of data research that I'm working on at the moment based on our current case files. And each of them is a standalone truth on its own. But I would like to tie them together by way of a narrative, because I really think it helps to really illustrate that idea of how complexities or risk factors compound for our young people. So we now know that from our case files that 88% of our families have experienced family violence or sexual violence, that 96% of our children and young people are struggling with their mental health, 3/4 of our families have got challenges associated with addiction, and that the vast majority, 85% of our kids, are really struggling at school. But what this looks like from a first-hand experience for our young people is that if you imagine yourself as a child who's grown up in a home where perhaps there is a lot of chaos, there's a lot of need, there is an exposure to family violence either directly or indirectly, so already your childhood experiences are ranking up, then one day you experience sexual abuse. When you reach out for support, you realise that access to counselling is extremely expensive, and you need to make a Sensitive Claims Act through ACC. Pre-COVID, sensitive claims applications to receive funded counselling for sexual abuse, the wait list was around 6 months. Now, post-pandemic, the wait list for sensitive claims is 12 months plus. So if you are a young person who has just experienced sexual violence, you are told by the system that you need to wait at least a year before you can access funded counselling. It is only natural then for the struggle that you are trying to navigate now, potentially on your own, that your mental health will start to suffer with things like depression or withdrawal, anxiety, and perhaps you might reach out to self-soothing coping mechanisms that are more accessible to you and within your reach. This could be things like substances, it could be things like risk-taking behaviour, and that will then build on your ability to be able to engage well at school. All of these factors then combine and compound, and they build even beyond the screen. Once you're finding it difficult to engage at school, your peer group starts to suffer, and when your peer group starts to suffer, perhaps your chances of offending might start to increase. Your potential positive outcomes for your future will start to decrease, and so on and so forth. So I'm just wanting to really illustrate that point, that these risk factors are not standalone, that each one of these factors that our young people are experiencing, and many of our young people experience them all, they compound and they build strength in numbers, which really underlines the idea that this cohort, children of people in prison, are a very deserving community of transformative justice who need a voice. So that is what I'm hoping to share with you with my next slides, some case studies from our front line. I would like to start with the story of A, who is 15 years old. A's dad has been in prison most of her life, and when he was released recently back into their home address, and just to pause there for a moment, Hokairangi has seen a lot of people being released back into the community on bracelets, which in itself as a standalone thing is a good move. But what we are noticing in the community is that the funding and the access to supports that this person might have potentially had in prison or in the justice system are not following these individuals back into their homes, back into the community. So all of a sudden, families who are already vulnerable are now expected to become the primary intervention providers for these people who are being released back into the community, because there is no wraparound, or a real lack of, I should say, wraparound care for people being released. So A's dad was recently released back to their home, where he soon began sexual offending against his teenage daughter. When A's family already had youth aid officers in place and child services in place, and A made a disclosure to one of the youth aid officers that she trusted, she made a disclosure to our pillar social worker that she trusted. and was told by the police that in order for them to be able to do anything, A needed to press charges against her father. But from A's perspective, she said, I can't do that because at the moment I'm being hurt. But if this gets out, if my whole family realizes what's happened or what's happening, my whole family will get hurt. And I'm worried that this might mean that my family might turn against me and I'll end up homeless as a 15-year-old with nowhere to live. This left the police and child services kind of locked in limbo because police were saying there's nothing we can do until you press charges. Child services saying there's nothing we can do until the police do something, which meant that ultimately this became A's burden to carry on her own, trying to find how she could navigate this very challenging and complex situation. And I think it exposes a real gap when it comes to community members coming home around the safety plans that are put in place and the safety plans that are followed up on that safeguard children and young people in homes where people are coming home. Thankfully, through the amazing support of that youth aid officer and our pillar social worker, A was able to find a safe home environment in the house of a family member where she now lives. And we were able to access some extra funding so that she could meet her travel costs to be able to still go to the course that she attends. And A is also receiving mentoring through our Pillars mentoring program and is doing really well. I would now like to tell you about a child called T, who was 8 years old when we met him. And T's father was also on a long prison sentence for sex offending. T's father was convicted of the sex offending that took place inside their home. And we were actually able to match T with a really robust mentor who happened to be a probation officer himself. And very early on in his mentoring journey, T disclosed to his mentor, I know what my dad did, but the really scary thing for me is that there's a big part of me that hates him and is scared of him, but there's another part of me that loves him, and that I'm really scared that this might mean that I'm sick in the head, because what kind of boy would love a man who does things like that? I heard Belinda mention a similar quote in her presentation. These are very complex and challenging circumstances that a well-resourced adult would struggle to navigate, let alone a poverty-stricken child. T was living in a home where they had very limited access to food and to healthcare. Their housing situation was very unstable. And through the support of our pillar social worker, we were able to move them into a brand new home. All of the children were able to move school, and we were able to start getting some counselling involved for these young people as well. Back in 2016, we did an art exhibition called My Journey, where our children and young people were invited to create a piece of artwork that they thought represented either their present, their past, or their future. And that painting in the corner you can see there is what T depicted as his present. And when I asked him to tell me more about his painting, he explained the 4 flamingos on the bottom are the boys who are bullying me at school, and I've made myself the lion on the mountain. I think it's really important to underline one of the first goals that T set with his mentor was the simple goal of learning how to kick and catch a ball. This sounds like perhaps quite superficial on the surface, but T's dad was not the kind of person who had ever taught him how to do things like this, which meant that T was not able to join in at lunchtime or make friends, and that compounded, and he became isolated and ostracized in his school environment. But with his mentor, he was able to learn that skill, which was able to compound the other way and when he was able to start building friendships, he was able to start building his own support network, and through that his own self-esteem and confidence started to grow. I've also included there a little picture from T, which was in his Pillars journal, which was an evaluation tool I wrote as part of my master's called Te Waka Kotahitanga. One of the questions the kids are asked is, if you could change something about the world, what would it be? And T has drawn a picture of a tank there and crossed it out and written that there would be no wars. And he also made sure to draw a picture of a tomato there and tell us that there will be no tomatoes ever again. So I think it's nice to remind ourselves in these moments that no matter what a child is going through, that they are a child and that they deserve to have the childhood that all New Zealand children deserve, one of safety and happiness and positivity. I'd like to wrap up now with the case study of N, who is 16 years old. N is also a sexual abuse survivor at the hands of their father, who is still currently incarcerated. N made the really valid point, again identifying one of these extremely important gaps, that when their father was arrested and went to prison, yes, it made the abuse stop, but the reality for N and their family was that they relied on their father's income to survive. And when he was put in prison, they were catapulted to a level of poverty that left them very vulnerable. Food was so insecure for N and their family that both he and his brother developed eating disorders, which compounded for them into the idea that they really sort of internalized this idea that if they ate food, they were wasting money, and which for them became we don't deserve to eat. This was their mental health really began to suffer as a result of the poverty that they were living in. We have been able to walk alongside N and their family and match both him and his brother with amazing mentors. And I've included N's 12-month evaluation in his Pillars journal, which has just indicated there a snapshot of their journey, that before he met his mentor, he felt he spent too much time staring at screens and was very lonely. But now, having spent 12 months together, hanging out with his mentor is the highlight of their week, and he feels more confident in himself and in his relationships. And in his future, he is actually starting to set goals for himself on the horizon to get a part-time job and to one day go to university and perhaps even become a psychologist. So where to from here? I hope that these stories have painted a picture for you around the level of need, the level of the deservedness that children of people in prison are an invisible cohort who are not receiving the support that they need. Families of prisoners are far too often kind of cast aside as people who need to navigate the justice system by their own means. However, we know the research tells us that all this is doing is perpetuating intergenerational harm. We would like justice systems throughout the world to become, for family support to become a priority throughout justice systems in the world, that public awareness and education needs to be a priority as well when it comes to addressing the changes in the justice system, and that these are actually evidence-based changes that will be taking place. We would like bipartisan cross-party agreement on any evidence-based policy that is transforming the justice system, and in particular for legislation that protects children. I would like to also just underline that point about the value of strengthening communities as opposed to pouring investment into that ambulance at the bottom. Let's work on strengthening the fence at the top. Let's work on strengthening those footholds halfway down the cliff. So how has Pillars done that most recently? We have just established our amazing youth advisory panel. That's us on the left on our first day together, and on the right at a recent meeting we had with members of the Office of the Inspectorate and with Sirkin Workman, one of the advisors for Just Speak, which led us to hot off the press, sent to the New Zealand government only a week and a half ago, an open letter that Pillars and Just Speak are calling for the implementation of children's care plans as a piece of urgent legislation, where when someone goes to prison or is sentenced to a community sentence in New Zealand, if they have children, that there is an automatic process that begins through a whānau outreach liaison role that would be established in every court in New Zealand. That automatic process would start this building a care plan for every child that would be unique to every child, and that would hopefully give every child of people in prison in New Zealand a fair chance at accessing the support that they deserve. We would also like bipartisan agreement on this legislation in order to protect it from penal populism and put child safety and well-being, put family safety and well-being at the centre of justice policy. So I would just like to thank you now with this Māori proverb, he taonga rongonui te aroha ki te tangata. Goodwill towards each other is a precious gift. I know everyone on this call has perhaps dedicated their lifetime or their career to transformative justice, and I would just like to put it out there that we're all doing our part. None of us can do this on our own in isolation, but that all of us are contributing a really important role, and it's been an absolute pleasure to be here with you all for me this morning on this beautiful Wednesday. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corrina. That was very, very enlightening. And I really appreciated hearing about the New Zealand context and thinking about how it relates to our context here in Canada, particularly with respect to Indigenous people involved in the justice system. I'm wondering, can you send us a copy of the open letter so that we can share?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, I
think
can.
that would be a really important resource. And I also just wanted to mention something, just about all of our presentations are common themes throughout, but the one I notice of interest, particularly since I study this, is just the role of isolation and loneliness and community connection in the social reintegration process. So I'm really glad to see that addressed. We are running a touch late, but I'm wondering if the panelists can stick with us for a few extra minutes so we can take questions from our audience, but no obligation, no pressure. And if people have questions, please just put them in the chat window and we will go through some of them. But to get the ball rolling, I wanted to ask a question from one of our Citizen Advisory Committee members in Quebec. And I'll just pretty much read it verbatim. So 10 years ago in Canada, funding for both public mental health delivery and penitentiary sexual offender programming was severely reduced. The effect was to funnel those with sexual mental health issues out of publicly funded mental hospitals and into prisons. At the same time, the level of education of those providing sexual offender programs in penitentiaries was reduced from the PhD and master's psychology level to the BSc psychology level. Can the Canadian members of the panel comment on the effect of this? And can the international speakers compare their country's experience with that of the Canadian? It's a question of just training and who's providing services and whether there are sufficiently adequately trained people in the system to provide programming. And anyone can jump in, just please unmute yourself.
I think that's probably your answer, isn't it? It's difficult to know quite what to say in terms of the problem is the cuts everywhere just mean that what support is available is sometimes geared, has to be geared, is geared towards a more punitive approach that I really recognise that those discussions going on about the sort of evidence base that says actually provide support, provide interventions, provide integration, versus the public desire and the media, in particular, perpetuated desire for a punitive approach, which the notifications, the community, the registrations, etc. And that's the battle that really needs to be fought outside politics. But I'm kind of veering off. In terms of training, I think I mean, many of our probation officers, the people who are responsible for perhaps supervising or managing people with convictions in the community, been on long sentences, you'll find they're typically young females, the people running interventions are typically young white females. And thinking, I mean, it's something, project I'm working at the moment where we're looking at, so for Muslim men who are serving a prison sentence for a sexual offence, having interventions facilitated by white non-Muslim young women, having to talk about sex with young white women is really problematic. And so I think there's problems all around, really. It was nice to see how long it took us all to actually jump in there.
Oh, that's very interesting.
May I just also add, Eddy, as well? I think there's been another theme that I've noticed. It was something that jumped out in my thesis research as well as here today. The reliance when it comes to intervention. You're so right, Dr. Belinda, about the lack of representation and lived experience, and when it comes to those facilitating those spaces, but also I've noticed a real tendency to rely on volunteers. Throughout the world, we often kind of will rely on the goodwill or the kind of charity heart of people who, for whatever reason, and often very valid ones, will want to put volunteering time into these spaces and places. But often there is a real lack of kind of oversight of professionalism around even the most well-supported volunteer and the most well-trained volunteer is still a volunteer at the end of the day. And I think it speaks volumes to the lack of willingness to invest in having really well-resourced professionals make up a big part of that fence, rather than this reliance on people who are doing it in quote unquote their spare time. Yeah.
And I think even more when you people are being invited in with lived experience to be the lived experience kind of not guinea pig, but when it comes let's just employ people because they've got the right cause, regardless of whether they've got conviction or not. Oh no, that's a different matter then. If you're unless you're coming in under the lived experience badge, in which case, well, unless you've got a sexual conviction, in which case, you know, the criminal justice organisations don't want people anyway. Then it's about what about just employing people? What about regardless of whether they've got a conviction or not, for the skills and qualities they have, rather than pigeonholing them? But that's another rant.
No, that's very interesting. I have a research question. Perhaps Wendy can start with this, if there's even an answer. I was just thinking about the effectiveness rates of the CoSA interventions. I'm wondering to what extent that may be due in part to self-selection bias, because the people participating are volunteering to participate, and I'm wondering they're probably more motivated than other people convicted of a sexual offense, and so that may contribute to the success rate. And I'm just wondering if you have anything to say about that possibility.
Yes, I think that's an important question from a research perspective. From a programming perspective, it's vital to our program that our core members volunteer to participate, because it differentiates CoSA from institutionalized programming. And so it may well create that bias you speak of, but our priority has to be the integrity of the program. And even you know, in some funding situations, there's pressure to make it a more mandatory part of a release plan, and I think that dramatically changes the integrity of the program.
Mm-hmm. I actually had a similar comment from somebody at a conference I was presenting at. I was talking about a totally different intervention. It's like men's sheds to help reduce isolation and loneliness among people serving a sentence. And the speaker was asking, you know, is this something that you think should be mandatory as part of the reintegration process? And I was like, well, I'm not a fan of making something mandatory, particularly if it's social in nature, because if the person doesn't want to be there, it's really not useful to them or to the group. So you need to have that willingness to be there. So.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether the jury study, the randomized control trial, I was just trying to work out how they took their kind of a group, as it were, the control group. So it's so I'm just having I'm trying to have a quick look at what they did. I mean, there is you're right. There may be a selection bias. It's a bit like prison education. Perhaps people applying for it are the people who are in kind of a best place to go forward. But yeah, well worth looking at the jury, the DUWE, the Canadian, the Minnesota randomized control trial. Just have a look the work that's been done on that. But you are also looking at, typically, certainly in the UK, people are high static risk, which means that actually that even if there's some selection bias in terms of going to the circle, actually you're looking at people with a higher static risk of recidivism. So I'll query whether there's some sort of balancing there.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find, there was a question about volunteer recruitment strategies in our chat box.
My question, Eddy. That was my question, Eddy. Just, I was just really interested, building on my previous point about volunteers, because all of our amazing mentors at Pillars are volunteers. I speak from the heart when I say wholeheartedly how difficult that recruitment for volunteers can be, especially if you are working with a cohort who might have stigma surrounding them. And I just wondered what recruitment for volunteers looks like for you. I'm sure it's a very carefully navigated process to get around that stigma, and those really impressive statistics from your outcomes, I'm sure, go a long way. But what does that look like for CoSA, looking for volunteers to become and I'm sure you, much like Pillars, looking for the right volunteers to be part of those circles.
Yes, and I think circles are most effective when you have a small group of volunteers who come from very different
Wendy, just a little louder if you could. Just having a little bit of trouble.
Yeah.
Thank
I
you.
always feel like I'm shouting.
No.
Corrina sounded so nice and relaxed, and I'm like projecting. But if we can have diverse volunteers within a given circle, and so we always are recruiting those from university contexts, and Dr. Winder just spoke about some of the challenges of the young white female student who's a volunteer. We continue to have a lot of volunteer recruitment through faith communities. CoSA in Canada started through the Mennonites, and they are a peace position faith community. And so restorative and transformative justice flow naturally out of some of their core values. We have a lot of retirees who are volunteers. And so then that is a diverse pool. Then those who have incarcerated family members who maybe are not direct, like a spouse or a child, but someone in the extended family, they become aware of some of the needs of those who are preparing for reintegration into communities. So really, we try to make the pool as diverse as possible. And post-COVID, it's a whole new ball game. It's many of our CoSA sites are starting all over again in some ways, as people are adjusting to even the idea of doing in-person circles again. It currently is a challenging time. The other thing I would quickly mention is that in more remote parts of Canada, where there's not a local CoSA site, or for some of our Indigenous populations where those who have the capacity and the experience and temperament to be a volunteer are already tapped out. They're already working at capacity within their communities. I think it's a real challenge for us to seek to have culturally attuned volunteers, those who can bring a voice of eldership, if you would say, in places where there's less population. And so as we're trying to figure out some of this virtual circle project, volunteer recruitment from more populated parts of Canada to serve those in more remote areas is one of the objectives. But that still doesn't answer the question around attunement for cultural, ethnic, and other identifiers that become quite important in circle participation.
Thank you for that. To circle back a little bit, and pardon my pun, there's a very interesting comment by Dr. Winder, and I'm just going to read it out and see if people have any comments. Again, and it goes back to the issue of language. So she mentioned that as well as the label of offender, the person in prison or on probation is also often the subject or the object of a verb, i.e. they are said to be reintegrated, which can be disempowering. And also being released into a community isn't to be reintegrated. There's an implication in this that the person is returning, but actually they are making steps towards a first-time integration into families or communities as someone with a criminal conviction. I thought that was a very good point. I'm just wondering if others would like to chime in again, just about language.
I just would like to tautoko or support what you were mentioning as well, Belinda. Here in New Zealand, our justice strategy, Hokairangi, makes a statement right there very early on in the early pages about the importance of trying to move away from words like prisoner, but using more multifaceted terms like person and prison. And it's interesting because even something so simple or kind of seemingly simple as terminology of how to address someone we've heard it ourselves, can elicit this really strong response from the public, from the media. Again, looking at that that we're kind of locked in that status quo of who deserves to be called what, or somehow that my human rights have diminished or been completely taken away because of X, Y, Z. And I think it really speaks volumes again to the role and the responsibility of the media when it comes to introduction and creating fundamental thinking shifts around the importance of language, that the media has a huge part to play when it comes to whether they want to incite and perpetuate this this debate or this inflammatory division, really, or come from an evidence-based place that says this is what keeps communities safer. The more connected someone is, the safer people will be, the more reoffending goes down, so on and so forth. But I yeah, just wanted to build on that, the responsibility of the media, rather than having that clickbait kind of anger inciting reporting on things like that.
Which piles up the fear as well, and it's things even like the sort of the stranger danger that the kind of certainly our kind of tabloid press some years ago really pushed around, which meant that in effect people kept their children kind of like in front of the TV, which means nice Mr. Jones from next door, they need babysitters, and nice Mr. Jones from next door who offers to babysit Friday and Saturday nights. Well, it's considering the number of incidents, and instead you've got children not getting enough exercise, not getting out enough, and desperately ask people just to take someone to babysit because much better they stay in the house. And so where all this pushes against the evidence, it's just you're right, it's inflammatory and it goes against the evidence base, and you really need to take the media to say, actually, no, we want to help reduce people's levels of fear. It's realistic. It's not going to be naive. It's not explaining. It's not absolving anything. But we are going to keep things in proportion, and we're going to work towards an evidence base that increases public safety. But yeah.
Maybe a very quick
Just wanted to say one last thing as well, building on that too, that I think it really gets to the heart of what societies want their justice system to actually, what we actually hope our justice system to do, or what is a prison system for? Is it about public safety, or is it about concepts of sort of retribution, or quote unquote, what does justice actually mean? And I think the more that we tend towards, we want someone to pay for what they've done, to hell with rehabilitation, the more we lock ourselves into that just continual recidivism loop. But the more we're able, as we all know on this call, the more we're able to move towards rehabilitation, the higher our chances are of having an effective justice system that's safer for everybody.
Yeah. Great questions, great discussion, everyone. Just a note on language, I feel like using these terms like offender, prisoner, things like that can almost reinforce those unconscious biases and stigma that we try to overcome as well. And maybe I could ask a question directed to Sherry, as well as kind of bridging a question that was asked in our participant chat as well. Maybe Sherry, could you sort of expand moving towards a transformative or restorative justice? Would that help with sort of becoming more open-minded to using alternative language? And just to kind of touch on a question that was asked in the chat as well, we had a participant who was interested in how to start or become involved in CoSA. If you could expand on that as well.
Glenn, hi, Sherry. So Glenn would say, like he said, transformative justice, because like people were saying, like you're reintegrating into something that you were never integrated into to begin with. If you think about, you know, systemic racism and the number of people that, like, you know, the overabundance of people who are Indigenous or people of color that are in prison, you know, so like I don't think about reintegration. I think about, again, and like having somebody come home. I use the word person in prison. That's what I would say, although sometimes you could catch me saying offender, but what I really say is I say person in prison, or I just say the person's name. You know, because I can remember with something that we were doing on collective impact, somebody said, so how do you talk to them and whatever? I said, we go on road trips. You know, like if you treat people as people, then that's how it is. If you meet people at their point of need. And so I think about those things, and I don't, and then, like I said, in our community, we're very open. Like we were out, like I use that terminology deliberately, like we were out, everybody knows. You know, so everybody knows who we are. And I can remember when our daughter had to talk about, you know, their parents going to, you know, what do your parents do for work? And this is like she was in grade 6. So she went in and said, my daddy is serving life, but my daddy, this is what he does for work. And this is what we do. So I don't know. Like you just treat people as people. Like my dad used to say that, you know, like he used to say to me about my university degrees, that it's good you have them, but if you don't know how to treat people, you might as well put them on the outhouse wall. And so I think it all comes to like how we treat people and how we see other people treating people, and whether we back up people when we see other people treating them like shit, and if we're just like basic with them. I don't know. I don't know if that answers things because I'm trying to hear and it's really soft.
No problem. That was very helpful. And just to quickly touch on a participant's question as well, how can individuals sort of help with getting CoSA started in their region or become involved?
Yeah, please go to our website, cosacanada.com. It is our national office, CoSA Canada, that helps to launch new sites. But if you're looking at volunteering, we would probably direct you to one of our 15 local sites.
When we send out the video, link to the YouTube video, I think we'll send out a list of resources with web links for people who are interested. A question for you, Wendy. You may have addressed it, but I'm not sure. How does CoSA compare with other programs? I was reading about one in particular in the US called Fearless, and that's like it seems like it's more purely peer-driven, and they don't involve professionals of any type in any capacity. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all. And also just how does this differ from traditional counseling approaches?
It's interesting because CoSA kind of falls in between peer-to-peer support and therapeutic support, in that volunteers are not exactly peers. They're not formerly incarcerated persons. Usually they're not people who have been convicted of sexual offenses. So I think it is a different kind of modeling that steers away from foraying into the therapeutic. We recognize our limitations and the boundaries that our volunteers, even if they're a therapist in their professional life, when they're in the circle, they're acting as a community volunteer. And so they don't bring that credential expertise into the circle. So if you think about it as a continuum from peer to peer through to therapeutic, CoSA kind of falls in the center.
Thank you for that. That explains quite a bit. And there's a paper that came out, I think last year, comparing the CoSA model with Fearless, and there was another model as well. I think it was one of those, it's a program for sexual addiction, and it was an interesting compare and contrast. So I might include that one in the list of resources. I do have a question for Sherry again. Glenn touched on this in his video a little bit, but one of the things that long-term people re-entering the community after a long time in prison experience is just the feeling overwhelmed by choice and not having a structured routine. And I'm wondering how LINC helps them overcome that.
Okay, was that a question for me, Eddy?
Yes, it was. So how does LINC help?
Can you repeat, please?
So for people who are coming out of prison after many years inside, they can feel very anxious out in the community. There's like a lot of choice and they may have trouble making decisions.
Yes.
No structure. So how does LINC help with that? 'Cause that's a really big barrier.
Okay, so we have a bunch of things. One, we have people can come, we can talk to them one-on-one. We have groups. We have usually, well, during COVID, we haven't had them, but we have weekly support groups where people talk about what's happening in their lives. And there's lots of common factors to getting out of prison and how you're feeling. And also about what their family members can also belong to group. But like, for instance, I had someone who had known Glenn for 30 plus years, and I had known him as well. And so he got out he'd been basically incarcerated since he was 5. He was serving a life sentence, life 25, but he'd been in different places. He was a person of African descent. He got out December the 1st of last year, had cancer. He's since passed away, but what you do is you meet people at the point of need. So you take them around. Like he was interested, he wanted to travel around in a car. He wanted to go, he loved Walmart. He wanted to go to get something to eat. He wanted to go fishing. So we went out fishing on the Fraser River. You just think about what you treat people as people. Like, I mean, at one point in time, he was having a little bit of a hard go because they were changing his cancer medication, and he was getting kind of angry and kind of grumpy. He was volunteering at Emma's Acres, so that's another way for us that people, they come back, they volunteer and stuff. And so, he came to live with me. He lived with me. He was between the halfway house and living with me. Because if you can have people you can talk to, then you're not going to feel like Ronnie did, that he didn't belong. If you have, people that will listen to you and talk about all the things. I mean, think about it. You're sitting there talking to somebody night on a Saturday, and he's explaining about how when he was 16, he was in a car with some other guys, and the one guy was shot in the head, and he was talking about his brains being splattered through the car. Like you get different things at different times. I mean, there was stuff that happened in jail that Glenn didn't talk about till like 10 years or so after he got out. So I find that people have a tendency, you just wait until they're ready to talk to you. But what you do is you show them, if you're unconditional love or unconditional feeling, then it helps. But group we do, the volunteering we do, the fact that we don't hide who we are, we encourage people also to do the same. we have usually, although we'll have it next year, we have a Christmas dinner that we put on in Mission, which is that everybody in the community could come to. So it's a clean and sober Christmas dinner. It's like 300 people plus that come to it. So we do things so you belong and you're not isolated.
Mm-hmm. There's a group in Montreal I heard about called Open Doors. They do something similar. They put on a lot of social events. And I think that they just published a book about their work because they've been around for 25 years. I think it's called Open Doors. And I think one of their members was on the call today. So that might be worth looking at. And I will put the information about that book in the resources. We're going to do just 2 more questions. I have one specific one, and then Swayam will end with a broader one. So this, I think, is for Corrina or others. Families here in Canada are often unable to visit their incarcerated loved ones because the institutions are in remote areas or people are incarcerated far from their home communities.
Sorry to interrupt. Corrina just mentioned she might have to leave in a few moments.
Okay,
I can answer this. I can answer this last question, Eddy, if that's okay, and then I will need to get to my next appointment.
Yeah,
I'm afraid.
no, so basically, is this a challenge in New Zealand, and does Pillars help families cope with this problem?
Absolutely, it's a challenge. It's a huge barrier for many, because we have 18 prisons throughout New Zealand, but there is very little consideration when it comes to where a person goes to prison in regards to where their family lives, and the ability that the family might have to visit them. We also have limited access to certain programs. For example, a particular drug and addiction intervention program might only be available in one particular prison. That could be in the opposite end of the country. And if we get told far too often that a family who might have been visiting their parent every Saturday for 7 years arrive for their scheduled visit as they always have done, only to be told by staff on arrival they've been transferred to the other end of the country so that they can attend this program. And families say, but no one asked us, no one consulted us, you know, why are we just hearing of this now? And the answer is, we don't have to ask you. You have no say in this. And what we also hear from working with our people in prison is that correctional staff are facing a difficult balance of their own about maintaining the prison population and maintaining people in prison's rights. So they will often not inform the person themselves that they're being transferred to the other side of the country until the night before, because quote unquote, this is coming directly from our collaboration with groups of people who've done research in the prisons. They don't want to deal with that person's difficult behavior for weeks, knowing that a transfer is coming up, so they will tell that individual the night before. Again, prison operational kind of logistics taking priority or precedence over the safety and well-being emotionally and physically of families. Long story short, Eddy, Pillars is a charity that doesn't have resource to be able to provide support for families who need transport to get to a prison to visit their person that they would like to. But there is an organisation called Te Pā who does, who is able to provide support for families needing access to transport. However, it's limited. It's limited. We need to think more carefully from a policy and legislation perspective that to stop the prevention, rather than the kind of how do we always just ask a charity or charitable organisation to fix this once it's already happening. Sorry, that came out a bit sort of rah, but yeah, it's just because it's so unfortunate and difficult.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for that and for staying. And we don't want to keep you. We don't want to keep any of our panelists. Swayam may have just one final closing question. Whoever needs to go, please go. We don't want to keep you.
Yeah, no pressure, but just one final question, a little bit of a general question as well. So what are the unique cultural factors that need to be considered when you're delivering programs to people who are serving a life sentence or to the populations convicted of a sex offense?
Is that a question for me, Swayam?
Yeah, to everyone. If you have a moment to answer, feel free.
Sure,
but I know you have to get going.
So I just would like to build on what Wendy was saying about the importance of cultural competency. any country who's been affected by colonization, we all echo the same statistics about the overrepresentation of our Indigenous families. And also, Belinda, you're quite right to point out, you know, people who are young white females taking roles as interventions or facilitators. It's really important for people, in particular people like me, but for all practitioners, to upskill and take a lifelong learning approach to cultural competency, in particular for Indigenous tikanga, for Māori, te ao Māori, or the Māori worldview here in New Zealand. It is really it's vital that practitioners on the front line take cultural competency as a priority that they need to continually upskill in, and I think also be led by families and be led by the people themselves. Sherry, like you were saying, just treat people as human beings and meet people where they are. That is a big part of our core values at Pillars as well. I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm going to need to excuse myself. It's been absolutely amazing meeting you all. And I will be sure to, I will email you my PowerPoint with my reference list, as well as the open letter. I see Anna Duff also posted it in the questions link there as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
So much, Corrina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good afternoon. See ya.
You too. So do any of the other speakers have anything to add to that or jump onto that?
Well, I would just add that CoSA had its beginnings in the faith community. And so in our volunteer training, we sometimes need to encourage our faith-based volunteers to relinquish some of the expectations they may bring in terms of mixing religion with the core member centered approach we take in our circles that must transcend any religious convictions. And so every time it's the question of going in without assumptions and continually doing the interrogation of our own bias and really listening deeply and actively to the story of the core member. And anyone can find themselves caught up in committing sexual harm. That's really just the truth. It could be any of us. And so there is no caricature or profiling of our core members. It is the dignity and value and humanity of each core member and discovering, first of all, their strengths, but also the pain and suffering in their story, and developing empathy and trust together in very open-minded ways. Of course, in addition to everything that Corrina said about cultural competence.
Excellent, thank you for that. Belinda, do you have any parting comments?
No, I think I'm getting, it's 11:15 here at night. So, and it's been, all I would say is it has been fantastic to listen to a group of people that I've learned so much from everyone talking, and I've been emailing some people, not that we've been emailing behind the scenes, Eddy, honest, but but I think there's so many commonalities we have, and some of the issues that all our countries face, and in terms of and what we are trying to do. And that was a lovely finish from Wendy. Actually, yeah, I can't say better than that.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And what time is it there now in the UK? It is.
It's close to 11.
It's bedtime.
But England won, so.
Oh, that's good. There you go.
Great.
Wonderful.
Well, I think that sort of brings our time together to a close. Maybe Dennis, if I could just give you the floor, if you had a few words to share with our group.
Sure, thanks, Swayam. I know it's getting long here, but yeah, I just wanted to again express my sincere thanks and appreciation to our panelists for taking the time. Again, I know it's getting very late for some of you, Belinda, and but for all of you to jump on and share different perspectives. I think we've seen and heard a lot commonalities and challenges that we face in our different countries, and about the need to treat people with respect and dignity, and believing in the capacity for people to change, whether that is those convicted of crimes or those families and people that are part of their lives. So certainly a lot to chew on and think about, but again, I just want to say thank you so much to all our guest speakers here today for sharing with us.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for such an enlightening and informative conversation today, and also being so accommodating with your time. So just to kind of give everyone a heads up, again, the video will be uploaded to YouTube, and we will email the link as well. And feel free to share this, the webinar once posted, to anyone in your network and your peers as well. It would be great to share this information, and we'll also be sharing a list of resources when we send out the video. And if you'd like us to include any information about your organization, feel free to email Eddy. I think he'll post his email up somewhere, but you can reach him at elmer@eddyelmer.com. So with that being said, thank you all so much for attending, and hopefully we'll see you all next year. Thank you.